Today we're going to read the story titled Henry's Freedom Box. And this is actually a true story from the Underground Railroad. So while we're reading today, I want you to think about the story's elements. So when we think about a story's elements, we think about our characters, the setting, and the plot. Now, today we're going to talk a little bit more about plot. So with the plot, we're talking about rising action. So what is building up some suspense until you reach the top of the peak, like the top of the mountain. So that was what we call the climax. That's like the most suspenseful piece. And then we have the falling action. Okay, so we're going to see if you can determine that while we are reading the story. Here we go. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where their master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. So what is that hinting to us? One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. But the master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. So we know that he's being sold or being given to his son. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. He did not tear that tobacco leaf, the boss yelled at the boy. "Oh, do not tear that tobacco leaf," he yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, then another, and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. I'm videotaping myself. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. What do you think might happen? His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No," cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. All right, so here we have some rising action, right? So we're learning that they were married, and now his wife has been sold, and so has his children. And yet he has to keep working it so he doesn't get beaten. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves were tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father! Father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her at the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy too was gone. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see was the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. So again, some more rising action. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of the tree and into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free.
Going to the dentist. Fun time.
But how? As he lifted a crate and he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box, then Henry. "What if you cough and someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," said Henry. Can you tell what this says? Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnston, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up with care." Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger. But Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. "No," cried James. Henry poured it onto his hand. He burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. So he's willing to sacrifice losing his finger or something to just be free. The sun was not up yet when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready," he said. James nailed the lid down. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. So he had to stay in that uncomfortable position. So more rising action. See if you can figure out where the climax would be. Where are we going to tip the top of the iceberg and then start falling down? So when the problem reaches its peak and then we start to find our solution. "I'm tired of standing," someone said. "Why don't we move that box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side. Now on his left. And suddenly, right side up. Phew! "What do you think is in here?" said the first man. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "I am mail," thought Henry. But not the kind they imagined. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car. This time head up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. He awoke to a loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia." At last, Henry had a birthday, March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom, and from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Fox Brown. So, the falling action came pretty quickly, right? It was almost like once you reached the top of that peak, it just came crashing down. So we're building up to he had had enough. His family was taken from him. And so he decided to be mailed in a box, which was also a very difficult journey. And then all of a sudden, he popped out and all was well. So what you're going to do next is you're going to fill out a story map. Yours is very colorful. Here's my story map. And after you fill it out, we're going to talk about what you should have filled out into your story map. All right, I hope you enjoyed the story.